Today, we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Claire Hankenson, who will be presenting on the revolution and evolution of the 3 R's in animal research: refinement, reduction, and replacement. And she'll also be discussing her reflections on art, ethics, and science. So I'll introduce Claire in just a moment, but first I have a few announcements, especially I'm not seeing many familiar faces in the audience today, so I'm excited to introduce you to the Research Ethics and Policy series. As you can see on the slide here, we have a great lineup for the rest of 2022. We plan to continue hosting the REP series through this hybrid format, both in person and virtually. So we welcome you to join us either way. Next month on April 4th, we'll hear from Dr. Greg Gonsalves, who will finally be able to be with us after several attempts at rescheduling. I believe his was the first lecture that got canceled due to COVID. And we will be thinking about the 2023 series scheduling pretty soon. So please don't forget to let us know if you have ideas, suggestions for people that we should consider inviting to the series, especially individuals from diverse backgrounds who would contribute to diverse perspectives relevant to research ethics and policy. Let's see. It's not. There we go. Oh dear. There we go. Okay. A brief reminder about some online resources that we have available from the department. You can see here a series of short research ethics courses that are available for free continuing education credit. Some of these are also able to be used to satisfy research ethics training requirements at Penn and CHOP, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that if folks have them. And thank you, of course, to our co-sponsors of the Research Ethics and Policy series who helped make this possible. Of course, thank you to Mary Pham for pulling everything together. It's been trickier, I think, now that we have to do things in this hybrid model. And now I will turn to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Claire Hankenson is the University of Pennsylvania's Associate Vice Provost for Research and Executive Director of University Laboratory and Animal Resources, as well as Penn's attending vet and leader of the Division of Lab Animal Medicine in the Department of Pathobiology in the School of Veterinary Medicine. She had previously been the Senior Associate Director of ULAR and just recently rejoined Penn after spending several years as the attending vet and Director for Campus Animal Resources at Michigan State. Dr. Hankenson is also the board chair of Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research, which is how I've had the pleasure of coming to get to know you. And we're really just thrilled to have you here today. I think this is our very first REP that's focused on animal research ethics. So we're thrilled to have a leader in the field talk to us about that today. And then the last word I'll make is how to handle questions and discussion. So when Dr. Hankenson is through with her lecture, we'll open things up for a conversation with those of you who are here in person, and then I will also monitor the chat online. If you have a question online, I will read it off for the group, and we can just kind of alternate back and forth. Okay, with that, you can take it away. Oh, sure. Pop up anymore.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here, and I have many familiar friends and faces in the audience. So thank you so much. Thank you very much to Holly. As she mentioned, she asked me to participate in this series, what feels like a lifetime ago, because it was maybe May of last year. And I thought, sure, yeah, sometime in the future. And here we are. I also want to thank Mary so much for your help in getting me organized and started today. And also to Steve Jaffe, who's part of the REP series as well. So as Holly mentioned, I am going to talk today about just some reflections that I've had over about 25 years working in animal research. And most importantly, I want to disclaim that these views are my own. There are many people in our industry that work in animal research that have talked about the 3 R's, have speculated about them, have written about them. So I've kind of tried to combine a lot of my experiences, but these really do just reflect my own thoughts. And really what I'm hoping is that we'll be able to continue to keep our lines of communication open about this topic and share one another's perspectives and move from there. All right. So sorry, Mary said I could do it off the keyboard. Sorry, one sec.
Yeah. There we go.
Oh, okay, super. Okay, thank you. All right. So as we begin, I just want to go over what the presentation, roadmap will be. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the artistic piece of this and why I wanted to have that in the title, and the ethical frameworks that we'll be addressing today. There are philosophies beyond the classic 3 Rs that I'd like to talk about, and then think more holistically about the what I'm going to call progressive 3 Rs, or sort of that revolution of what the 3 Rs have become. And then I just have a few sort of examples or case scenarios about where the 3 Rs is applying, and where, hopefully we'll foster some discussion or questions from all of you. So I want to start off just saying that during the pandemic, which I know fortunately we're about to come to some equilibrium on, let's say, I had a lot of time that came back, like we all did in our lives, because suddenly things that we used to spend our time doing were not available. And so what I decided to do was go online to the Barnes Art Museum, which happens to be in Philadelphia, even though at the time I was still living in Michigan. And I took an art history class, which I'd never had time to do during all of my sort of science training and veterinary studies. So as I was in the midst of these classes, and I took a number of them, it was when Holly had asked if I would be interested in participating in this series, which was really exciting. And I thought, well, I also was working on some 3 Rs initiatives in other facets of my life. And between the request to think about a talk and the 3 Rs and art, these things kind of started to converge in my brain. And so I wanted to talk philosophically with you, and again, thinking of it as a way to foster some discussion today. So the framework, here's the 3 Rs. They mean different things to different people. I will go through the classic definition briefly for you in just a couple of slides for those who maybe aren't as familiar with them. But I know, at least for my colleagues that are in the audience, in real life, in live audience here today, they're very familiar with these terms. And when we think about them, though, there are a lot of different interpretations, depending on whether you might be someone who works in veterinary medicine, if you're a veterinary clinician, if you're a veterinary technician, but what if you're an anthropologist? Or what if you're the scientist? Or what if you're looking just from a public perspective on what it means to work with animals in research? I think there's a lot of different things that can fit within that space. So I was thinking about the term framework, and then I was thinking about all these images I was seeing on my online Barnes classes, where I was looking at pictures of Seurat and Modigliani, and Van Gogh was a focus point too. So I'll talk a bit about Van Gogh as we go through. But I was thinking about all of these frames and realizing that when we are going to deliberate on an ethical issue like this, I don't feel like we can limit it to a particular frame. I want to think about it more expansively as a platform or some sort of a concept, if you will. So you'll hear a lot that the 3 Rs is ethical framework, and I'm going to try to dispel that a little bit as we go through today. I think I really want us to make sure that the framework piece doesn't inhibit our ability to think more broadly about the balance of ethics and welfare, particularly the benefits to animals in science that are going to come from the work that we do. So some people maybe have not seen this before, but this is what was called the French Salon. So I learned about this again in my classes, and I thought it was just so apropos because it was a huge room full of pictures in frames that went from floor to ceiling in this massive, expansive space. So it was held in Paris, and it was a state-sponsored huge art exhibition. It was held annually with academically trained artists, and it was the official venue for the time of showing off all of the art. It was pretty conservative, so the art itself had to be within a certain scope to be able to be hung in this space, but there was a hierarchy of how the work would be depicted on the walls. Started in the 1660s, so this has been going on for a very long time. And it was really deemed to be the greatest annual art event in the Western world in the 1750s through the 1900s. So if we're going to use the art analogy for some baseline of the talk today, we are the audience. So we are the people that are kind of standing on the floor, if you will, in this salon. We're the scientists, we're the animal care workers, we are the public, we are the ethicists, we are the regulatory overseers. And depending on where we're standing all together on that floor, with the walls plastered in art, we're gonna get a different perspective on that particular piece. So the perspective is going to be viewed differently depending on where we look at things. And so I wanted to use this as an analogy to show that the 3 Rs are not stagnant, and they've been held that way in a lot of ways, that the classic 3 Rs as they're defined, they really aren't two-dimensional, and they are going to demand continuous movement and assessment related to societal changes, scientific discoveries, and who we're sitting with in our sort of evolution of what the 3 Rs as we're having these conversations. So there have been and continue to be very important medical advancements that have involved animal research and just the quality of life and care for animals in general. So I've listed here sort of representative Nobel Prize winners in medicine that have preceded and have occurred since the inception of the 3 Rs, which happened in the mid-1900s. Now, all of these medical discoveries involve the use of animal models. And if you're interested in more information, you can go to the Foundation for Biomedical Research site, and it will show you more detail about these accomplishments. But as recently as just a couple of years ago, the CRISPR-Cas technology won the prize in chemistry. And as many of the people certainly in the audience that work with animals know, and others maybe on the seminar today online, it's a technology that is already having huge impacts on the animal models that we're using and what we'll use in the future. So I'll talk a little bit about a case study with CRISPR-Cas toward the end of the talk. And so I just want to talk about this in relation to the fact that we have had amazing discoveries using animals. So the use of animals has been incredibly important and continues to be. And so when we're framing it in the origin of the classic 3 Rs, here are the terms if people have not heard them before. So they've been branded the 3 Rs now for many years. But for those who maybe aren't as familiar with animal work, the terms specifically are replacement, reduction, and refinement. And these came about, as I said, in the mid-1900s. Two scientists, William Russell and Rex Burch, coined these terms at the time and said that the scientific excellence and humane use of laboratory animals would be inextricably linked. So they established them really as part of a new applied science at the time. And they were aiming to improve animal welfare with the 3 Rs as a launch pad for future development of scientific methods and medical discovery. But they've sort of become this ultimate ethical benchmarking tool against which the high quality of science in the academic and industrial sectors is measured, with an increasing focus on thinking about alternatives to animal use in research. But that's really important to go back to the origin, the source, to say that was never their intention. Russell and Burch weren't thinking about alternatives at the time. Really, when we think about it now, the 3 Rs should be more prevalent in global discussions related to the humane use of animals in all aspects of research, teaching, and testing. And they're really just a foundation. They're not the holistic frame, as I said, in terms of refinement, reduction, replacement for our veterinary teams, for ethical review committees like the IACUC, and for the scientists. So why are they being challenged? Well, as I said, I'm going to just do a little of my own artwork here just for fun. But so we think about the 3 Rs as an umbrella. I'm going to use this term to put an R in each of the folds of the umbrella in this way. And what I'm concerned about is that they have been misappropriated at times in our society and certainly by the public that maybe doesn't understand them, or actively by animal groups, rights groups that want to abolish the use of animals in any sort of sector of work that's being done in our society. So when we think about, in fact, replacement, which is the term that probably mostly has been used for thinking about alternatives, there's also a cohort of individuals who think we should replace animals completely. We should not have animals in any use in our lives. We also hear a lot about reduction being a concern because we should limit the number of animals to as few as possible. But I'll show again why that's really challenging to do in our current scientific environment. So we have to think about what are accomplishments? How do we balance sort of cost benefits to this? So if we look at these classic terms and we think about reduction and replacement, it's not necessarily going to be an accomplishment for humans' benefit if we use fewer animals when we have more evidence of disease and illness going on in the world. And it's not supposed to be a failure of the 3 Rs if we look at more than just one sex, when we're looking at both males and females. It's not a catastrophe if we don't replace animals simply because we have to use an intact body system and a physiology that has measurable responses for us to get information for human impact too. So I doubt that there's anyone that would refute that our classic 3 Rs therefore need to be expanded in their definition. Certainly we have to realize there's been a massive transition in how the world views science, discovery, and animal use since the mid-1950s. The 3 Rs is often referenced as our ethical framework, as I keep saying, but instead let's think about it as a tool, one of many that should be used by the community to assess the cost benefit or harm benefit of using animals in scientific discovery. So when we look at these, I wanted to just bring up again, just briefly back to the art thing. So there's a classic term called a triptych. So a triptych is 3 photographs, 3 images all together. So if we go back, we can see that the 3 Rs fit in that. And I wanted to overlay them briefly to show again why we can't keep holding them to the same assessment. So does anyone know this photograph? It's called The Postman by Van Gogh. One of these is hanging in the barns. I would recommend you go see it, the one on the left. But just a little bit of background about the Postman. So Van Gogh, for most of the year of 1888, he lived by himself in a room in the town of Arles in France. And he saw a lot of people that walked back and forth to the train station that he lived by every day. And one of them was this gentleman, Joseph, who was the postman for that town. And so he became a good friend of Van Gogh's and also a very important artistic subject for the paintings. So between July of 1888 and April of 1889, Van Gogh painted 6 portraits of Roland. And in each of these, he's wearing his dark blue postman uniform. But if we look closely at each of the beards, which he was a salt and pepper kind of beard, well, this was the amount of color that was in Van Gogh's work really just was an ocean compared to, ocean of color compared to the black and white. So again, thinking about the 3 Rs as an artistic piece or as a map, we detect each differences each time we look at the 3 Rs, just as we would for art. So when we think about the context of what our contemporaries are doing in science, we have to think about social problems and social change. And a lot of this I was thinking about really before we knew as much as we do now about coronavirus and the pandemic itself. We have to continue to look at things from a new perspective. Each time we come back to them with our experiences, it's going to look a little bit different as well. So I'm going to ask everyone to kind of bear with me, be courageous and confident, and not just think of art as the finished product, not think of the 3 Rs as being done, but as something that's just much more vast than that. So moving into terms then to think about the transitional 3 Rs, if we open up the umbrella, we have more space. So everyone can just take a breath. Okay, now the 3 Rs is much bigger. And what's going to be part of that 3 Rs? Well, as I said, in 1959, this is when this term was coined. And it was in a book. And it really didn't make a splash. It was someone's thought at the time. It really wasn't until like late in the 80s that the 3 Rs even started getting any traction whatsoever. So they sat pretty stagnant for a good 20 so years. But in the meantime, there were other things that were happening to think about animal welfare and how we work with animals, in particular, the 5 freedoms. So the 5 freedoms specifically looked at aspects of animal welfare that were under human control. And this was done in the UK, developed in response to a 1965 governmental report on livestock husbandry. They themselves did not get formalized for many years until 1979, when there was a press statement that was put out by the UK Farm Animal Welfare Council. And since then, probably many of you in this room, have anyone heard of the 5 freedoms? So I know I have a lot of veterinary group folks here. So lots of nods for those of you who are not in the room with us. But they've been adopted in many ways by world organizations, Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So as I mentioned, since the classic 3 Rs weren't being embraced and really weren't known, other things started to come into play. And the next thing that was highlighted in an ILAR conference was the 3 S's. Now, how many of you have heard of the 3 S's? Right, I hadn't either. So the 3 S's were another thing that sort of was announced and celebrated. And really it wasn't until first in the 1970s, but it wasn't until a paper by Dr. Smith and Hawkins in 2016 that they brought these forward again. So almost 40 some years later. Conceptually, these laid right over the 3 Rs beautifully. It was good science, which is naturally the aim of all scientists. So from Carol Newton, who initially coined these, she wanted to say that experiments should be designed to reduce variation, permit effective analyses, and in general, be useful to obtain the most information with the greatest certainty in the shortest time using the fewest subjects. And suggestions were including better training and continuing education in relevant areas like good research practices, peer review, and lab leadership. Now, good sense was described as an essential tool in lab animal science. And this was interpreted to mean that the right animal gets used for the right issue, or what we talk a lot about, like we should pick the right animal model for the disease or element that we're studying. And it also still emphasized the fact that we would want to consider animals, and researchers should really think about the animals of choice and the approaches that they're going to use in order to minimize challenges with that animal. And lastly, good sensibilities. This, I think, was really forward thinking, and it was referring to the capacity to respond to or be affected by emotions or events working with animals. So this is empathy. This is empathy for the animals that we work with, for the research animals specifically, and the fact that we want it to be a reduction of any suffering as a prerequisite to choosing how we're going to work with the animals. Sensibilities now in our current world has really been substituted with culture of care, if you guys have heard that term before, and just sort of that sensitivity around animal care that we should have. And it's really important in lab animal science as we think about improving animal welfare and the conditions also, honestly, for our animal welfare caregivers too. So what Carol really thought was if we have good science, it's going to be founded in good sense and good sensibilities. So again, the 3 R's are sitting stagnant during this time. No one's really talking about them. All right. So then in 1985, there were some US governmental changes that occurred, and they were specific to looking at the knowledge that would be necessary for the improvement of the health and well-being of humans, as well as other animals, if there was going to be in vivo experimentation done. And these government principles still sit in the back appendix of the current guide for the care and use of lab animals. So for those who haven't seen them, we talked about the importance of appropriate transportation for animals, making sure that procedures that used animals, and I really highlighted this one because they should be thinking about advancing knowledge and the good of society, which I think sometimes gets lost in the current animal rights grouping of not using animals at all. Very importantly, we want to avoid and minimize any discomfort or distress. We need to think about the number of species and consider alternatives. So this is really where that first time that alternatives to animal use kind of came into the vernacular, not back in 1959, actually almost 30 years later. Using the appropriate types of drugs for sedation, anesthesia, and analgesia, making sure that we're using the euthanasia approaches appropriately to limit pain and suffering, have a veterinarian involved. So again, this was the first time it really was kind of mandated to think about having veterinary oversight and making sure people were trained. And the last one was the decisions of these principles shouldn't depend on just what the researcher thinks, but they have to involve review groups such as the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. So this was really when the IACUC first was described. So we're 40 years out, a little more so than that now. But again, that concept had not really been in place when we first were hearing from Russell and Burch. So I'll just touch on this briefly because I do think many people in the room have participated in IACUCs or sat in IACUCs, read protocols. So this is pretty important because I think there's been a little bit of a pendulum shift and swing on what an IACUC is viewed as doing, what their responsibility is. So just to show, for those who aren't aware, this is an animal ethics review board, if you will. In the US, it's called the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. And it is specifically mandated to include groups of people to ensure that there is a complementary makeup of people that are on that committee. So we have scientists that are actually doing animal work, veterinarians who are involved with caring for those animals. There are a number of staff who may be working with the kind of the paperwork aspects, if you will, of managing protocols. We also have to have public or local community representation, and that public member cannot have an affiliation with the institution, so they don't have a conflict of interest. And there are a number of things, very, very many, that this committee has to do at every institution. Some institutions, some academic institutions have many IACUCs, which sometimes can be a challenge because IACUCs are independent bodies that review things much like a study section for a grant review. The different people on that committee will drive the discussion and the philosophies differently. But overall, it's to make sure that the animal use is done according to what the scientists say they will do, make sure people are trained, make sure that the animals are taken care of. So what has seemed to happen in this sort of pendulum shift, as I mentioned, and there's an article that came out a few years ago, was that the IACUC is really being asked to do more of the ethical evaluation for the animals. In particular, that we must be more rigorous in deciding, yes, we're going to vote that this protocol can go forward, or no, we're not going to support this science. And that's really not the job of the IACUC. It never was. They were never supposed to be the ethical arbiter of the research that was going to happen within an institution. So there's also been critiques that IACUCs are not consistent in their deliberations. They're not consistent between institutions, and that somehow we're putting our committee members through that in a bit of an impossible position. It's really impossible to set standards when the people and the expertise differ at each of the sites where they may be working. And this also changes whether it's in an industry setting or a government setting outside of academics. So flexibility was built into the system, just as a reminder early on. So what if the perspective seems too rigid on that particular committee? Well, it was already baked in that you could bring in subject matter experts, you could bring in consultants. So if you didn't have the expertise, for example, to make a decision about a non-human primate area, you could bring somebody in that could sit with your IACUC and help give them perspective. It didn't have to be a voting member. They didn't have to come to every committee meeting, but you can bring in subject matter experts. And that's always a possibility. In the last year alone, I've been part of discussions, not specific to Penn or even to Michigan State where I was before, but the IACUC has been blamed for the reproducibility crisis, that they aren't mandating the reduction of animal numbers every time they look at protocols, which again, honestly is well out of the purview for this particular committee. So why is this happening now that the IACUC is being asked to be kind of the gatekeeper? To me, it's sort of placing blame on a group for really a lack of understanding about what the process is. We need more transparency. I think that is clear about what the process is for approving animals for studies, and having that transparency across not only the IACUC deliberations, but also just what the science is that we do with animals, I think will really help the scientists themselves understand what happens when they put a protocol in and why the process is handled the way that it is. Holly mentioned that she and I sit on the board for the Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research organization. And we've been talking about trying to educate with the public piece of that name. How can we help the public understand, who maybe now more than ever is questioning science and the process of how we use animals and humans in scientific discovery? How can we make sure the public understands the very rigorous steps that we go through as an internal community to let science go forward and decide what projects will proceed? So again, in highlighting this paper here, it does nicely discuss, if you're interested in looking at it, the intersection of the IACUC, how the scientists come into that, and the welfare considerations. But again, just encouraging folks to think about flexibility, thinking about animal number justifications. The IACUC is asked to use statistical review, if you will, for making sure in that reduction piece that we're using the fewest number of animals possible, but it has to still answer the question. So that's where if the animal rights groups say, well, you didn't decide on the fewest number of animals, we need to remind everyone, but it still needs to be the number of animals to answer the question. Otherwise, all those animals will be lost and wasted for use. All right, so I did want to highlight another thing that's another paper that came out several years ago now in 2015. This is an excellent review by Jerry Tannenbaum and Taylor Bennett. Really, I think kind of a must read for people that are interested in learning more about the 3 Rs topic. I know Dr. Bennett quite well, and Taylor and I were chatting in preparation for this presentation today. So what they really wanted to do was take the terms that I've described, the 3 Rs, and they wanted to go side by side with the original language and then parse out the initial intent and impact. So I've kind of done that enough. I don't need to belabor it on this slide necessarily, but I did want to come back to that term reduction again, which I've mentioned, because I feel is the one that is most on a target, let's say, that we're failing somehow in the 3 Rs. So I'm going to quote the author specifically briefly on this topic. The 3 Rs principle does not define reduction as minimization of the animal numbers used. Reduction is just that, reduction, which is not synonymous with minimization. In fact, Russell and Burch emphasize that it's often impossible to know in advance of an experiment whether the minimal number of animals will be used. Yet they emphasize the importance of statistical methods, and we're advocating for a new science of humane experimental technique. So as I've said, I think the term reduction has become a bit of a refrain for those who are opposed to animal research. And we need to make sure that if we consider aiming at absolute minimization, it's just going to be illogical in the face of any experimental design. Thinking in a more expanded way about reduction, it also could mean that we are reducing pain and stress overall. So that's, again, why we want to think about not just reduction as it was initially defined, but how we can think about it in a more broad way. And with reduction, I also want to bring up another principle that happened then in 2016. So studying sex as a variable to strengthen science. So women now account for roughly half of all participants in NIH-supported clinical research, and there's been a lot of work done in the last 5-6 years on this topic. But interestingly, the reason why this came up is because more often than not, basic and preclinical biomedical research has focused on male animals and male cells. An over-reliance on male animals and cells obscures the understanding of key sex influences on health processes and outcomes. So in order to respond to sex as a biological variable, NIH has put a lot of money into this and in fact mandated that both male and females of the species under study would have to be looked at. So you can understand that that then took what have been a reduction in numbers and actually doubled them. So we weren't complying with what someone might have thought of as minimizing the number, but we were accomplishing what was the scientific piece, which was how many animals do we need to get the best science and get the best answer out of it. So again, this is ongoing. There have been new reports put out just actually in 2020 about sex as a biological variable and how they've done in increasing both sexes and studies that people can take a look at as well. And then the last one, actually the last one for the most recent that I wanted to talk about was the concept of the 3 Vs. This was a paper that came out really looking at harm benefit analysis. Came out in the Lab Animal Journal in 2017. And Hanne Verbel is the author of this, and probably some in the lab animal field in the room have heard of him. And what he was interested in saying is that even if we put all of the statistics in place and make sure we have the fewest number of animals to answer the question, we still may not have scientific validity because that's one lab studying their one project at their one institution in their one environment with their one group of people, right? So can that even be translated across institutions? And not always. So his idea was, yes, let's make sure we're abiding by the 3 Rs, which is expected, but let's also consider the 3 Vs, which are related to validity. So his 3 Vs are construct validity, which is basing on the evidence, the level of agreement between the animal model and the quality that we're looking to measure. Internal validity, which is looking for the scientific rationale and rigor within that one lab group. And then external validity, which is let's benchmark what we found against what our peers found at other institutions. So his argument really is that we are not able to apply the 3 Rs without looking at validity because the scope of the animal experiments becomes too narrow. And that leads to lack of reproducibility. And then the argument that maybe we aren't being as rigorous as we should be in our work. So ironically, the 3 R efforts to minimize animal use may exacerbate the limited data output. And as a result, there's advocacy for more repetition of experiments across multiple laboratories, which then increases the number of animals, but to the point of getting to the right answer for the question that was sought in the first place. And I just want to mention this, and Steve Jaffe and I had a quick exchange about this when earlier in the fall, as we were leading up to this talk. This is a book that came out. I'm sure many people in the room have seen it, but it was it's probably the most recent treatise that's come out around thinking about the use of animals in research. The authors are preeminent ethicists, Tom Beecham and David DeGrazia, and they are looking at the general principles and the moral code around using animals in research. So there are 6 principles that are offered. 3 of them have to do with social benefit of using animals, and 3 of them have to do with animal welfare. It's actually a pretty slim text if people have a chance to pick it up and take a look at it. But the authors, really the 2 ethicists were just the editors, and there were authors for each of the chapters that represented each of these moral principles, some of whom were lab animal scientists, some of whom were lab animal veterinarians. So it too offers, and I'll use the term framework, an idea that bridges the gap between concerns in the biomedical animal protection communities, as well as the laboratory animal communities. Importantly, these were not meant to replace or compete with the 3 Rs. They just took this along that continuum I've been talking about. It's a next step in the path for our kind of holistic assessment of how we use animals in research. They do tend to reflect in a critique that I would offer on the classic 3 Rs. So there may be more of a limited interpretation in them, but I think they are very thought-provoking, and they're going to help us in our discussions that we need to have about the evolution and revolution of the 3 Rs. So bringing this all together then, under the larger umbrella that I've designed for the 3 Rs, we want to think about what else is under them. So I've mentioned the 5 freedoms. We've talked about the 9 US government principles, the 4 concepts for addressing sex as a variable. We've mentioned the 3 Vs, and then I've just touched on the 6 moral topics as well. So I want to challenge us to consider that the 3 R's is that progressive acronym. It's just an acronym. It's just a brand now. So we have to think about, it includes all of these successive and related topics. And I also was starting off with that umbrella, just one hand holding it, but I wanted to put 2 hands in place because we have to be working with our stakeholders to discuss aspects of the 3 R's in order to consider the ethics and benefits. So let's talk about the animals then. We're talking about all the concepts about not using animals, but what do we get out of studying animals themselves? There are many advances. People in this room have been critical to advancements at the University of Pennsylvania in animal work, and again, specifically for the benefit of the animals themselves. Critics of the 3 R's often cite the inherent harm to animals that is a fallout of limited ethical review. However, to that critique, we have to respond with data and facts and objectivity about the information gains that have been made in veterinary science and the involvement of veterinarians and veterinary technicians in virtually every assessment of contemporary animal use for research purposes. So this is the oath that I took as a veterinarian that many people that are in this room right now have taken. And I want to just highlight that part of our expectation in our career is that we're promoting public health and the advancement of medical knowledge. And importantly, that we're also considering medical ethics. So this is already baked into anyone that's coming into the field that's going to be involved with animal work. And the veterinary care is a mandate. We have to have people that are involved. Again, I'm not sure if the public recognizes this or realizes that this has to be in place. But these are all the expectations listed below for how and why the veterinarian is necessary. And we say a veterinarian, but in this case, there are probably 12 to 20 veterinarians at the University of Pennsylvania that collaborate on looking at how we use animals in research and studying the ethics of them. So just kind of in our last couple of slides on the art piece of it, it's a landscape. So this is one of Van Gogh's famous landscapes, again, called the wheat field. It's based on a color theory. Different colors are next to each other, and it alters the eye's perception of the strokes. The strokes themselves are really expressive in this. They almost seem to take on a physical appearance of their own. So it's a wheat field if you stand back from it. But again, if you zoom in closely, you can see that there's really quite a beautiful element to all the different colors that make it up. And I want to quote a colleague of mine who also is working on a 3 R's project with me, Dr. Melanie Graham. She's a non-human primate scientist in Minnesota. She wants to think about animal welfare, and she, at least in her lab and what I think as well, is that we're thinking about it at the individual animal level, not in broad ways. She notes that there are intrinsic links between welfare and scientific outcomes. Well cared for animals are going to lead to increased benefits of data outcomes. And then therefore, in her world, where she works with diabetes in humans, more translationally relevant applications. So in talking about the animals themselves, we have a lot of different things. We have just reactions looking at these photographs to these species. They can be emotional, they can almost be physical at times. It's just from looking at them. So when we think about how these animals are like us, how they empathize with us, and that even goes to rodents who've been shown to have empathy for their cage mates and others that are in the room with them. We need to think about how intelligent they are. In particular, if anyone has seen My Octopus Teacher, small plug, excellent documentary, it will change your thought process on the fact that because these animals don't have a backbone, they somehow may not have intrinsic intelligence. We attribute human traits, emotions, and intentions to non-human entities all the time. And this is the innate tendency of our human psychology. But at times we may be overly eager to project experiences onto an animal. Like sometimes we say there's a smiling dolphin coming at us, but really that animal is not terribly happy as we would describe it. There is an excellent review of this in Frans de Waal's work, for those who may know him from the European Primate Center, that I would encourage. He published, Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? In 2016. I see some nods in the room. It was just amazing. And several excerpts of that were in the New York Times as well. So we're learning about different ways to interact with these species, just for the species benefit themselves. Behavioral and environmental management techniques that we learn from working with them will allow us to work with them more closely and in a way that helps to develop their species-specific tendencies as well. So in the progressive 3 R's, under that umbrella, I want to put all the animals themselves. And when we're thinking about terms, these already exist. So I'm giving you, reassurance here. You don't have to come up with the definitions because they already have been made for us. So I mentioned here, this is from the NC3R site in the UK. On the left are the standard definitions, which I've showed from the beginning, which is really, again, the early baby stage. But these are adult concepts now, right? They've grown up over 50 some years. And this is how we think about them. So for example, for replacement, we're thinking about accelerating the development and use of different types of tools. We're thinking about the latest science that we can apply. And we're going to ask questions without the use of animals if we can. Reduction, as I mentioned, has been a limiting factor, but we want to design and analyze our experiments appropriately, making sure they are reproducible. And that may mean we have to use more animals to get to that point. And refinement is a huge one, certainly in my own research, but again, for many individuals that are in laboratory animal science, we want to advance animal welfare by thinking about what's the best we can do with them, whether that's a new anesthetic technique or understanding new types of enrichment that we want to provide to them. And just a plug too, that when we're thinking about animal research, there's a ton of it that's veterinary research related that benefits the animals themselves. This is just a small smattering of what we study, not only at the University of Pennsylvania in collaboration with the School of Veterinary Medicine, but across all the different schools that are here and across the veterinary community. So a couple of things about reduction of animals, just to end on these case studies that I just wanted to have us think about. So just again, raise of hands, and some of you can put your hands up, I guess. Mary can tag it, but how many people got a new pet during the pandemic? Okay, I've got probably, I'd say like 30% in the room, maybe. Yeah, it was a major phenomenon. There was evidence that came out and studies. This is the Michigan Veterinary Medical Association about the human-animal bond that really grew during the pandemic. There were papers that came out about the importance of people being socially isolated at home and having just another living being was incredibly important. So this was great. This was a lot more numerically, many more animals that came into our society in use for this. But from an ethical standpoint, this is now what's happening. So people have gone back to work and they can't take care of the animals, and the animals have to go somewhere. So shelters are overwhelmed. I have colleagues that work as veterinarians in shelter medicine, and they don't know what to do with all these animals. And many of them will unfortunately probably be euthanized as a result of that. It's putting a lot of stress and distress on those shelter workers that are hoping to find homes for these animals, but they are unable to do so. So again, I just want to start showing some of these ethical conundrums that we're in that we can certainly talk about. There's also been an article that came out about a year ago that how many animals are too many. And there was a paper that came out by Dr. Larry Carboni, who is a laboratory animal veterinarian. And he estimated that we're using something like 111 million mice every year in research. And that the outcry was that's too many, but we don't really know that that's too many because it wasn't necessarily a very thorough study, in my opinion. He got some people to respond to a survey of use, but not all institutions to respond. And the fact is that we still have a lot of things that we have to use these animals for. So to say that we're using too many, but not know what specifically maybe we're using them for is a little bit challenging. And the author of this, Mr. Grimm, kind of glosses over the important statements in the article, tilts the angle, I feel, a little bit to sort of animal protectionists. So if we look at sort of thinking about the number of animals, I just encourage everyone to do it in context. What's the data that's available? And then if we think about mice, well, okay, so mice are okay because a lot of times we're actually trying to get pest mice out of our houses and out of our barns and out of our facilities. We spend a lot of effort on that. So there's been an interesting shift to look at animals that are more like wild mice because of their immune system. So I just wanted to say, like, how does it ethically change if it's an animal that we consider a pest? And is that okay in our society to think about that? And so we shouldn't care that there's 100 million mice, because if they were in our house, we would do whatever we could to get rid of them. So again, I can't finish today without talking about this really amazing thing that's happened. So we've just had a pig heart go into a human body. First time there's been a pig transplant. So we think about the societal benefit. This went into, I think the patient was about 57 years old, chronic heart failure. This had been a 5-year process. On January, I think it was December 31st, the FDA approved. You can go forward to the research team and do the study at the University of Maryland. To my knowledge, she is still alive since the surgery was conducted around January 7th, I believe. The pigs were genetically manipulated using that CRISPR-Cas system that we talked about that won the prize in chemistry in 2020. And it's a really exciting time. Now, the animal welfare piece is that I know those animals came out of a company that has laboratory animal specialists that care for those animals, that those animals were manipulated so that they lacked, I think it was 3 sugars specifically that maybe would have rejected them from the human system. So they were recognized as self and not foreign when the heart went in. But animals had to die for that human to live. And so we have to think about, is that an appropriate use of animals? Is it appropriate that it's a pig? If you go to the organ donor site, which I just pulled this in advance of this talk, we have many, many more individuals that need organs than are able to get organs because it would require the death or potentially donation of an organ from another individual, another human, if we're going to meet the needs. And if we look at that more specifically about what's happening on a day-to-day basis in this country, what are the ethics of allowing, knowing that we have an alternative to allowing humans to pass away without the benefit of potentially having an organ transplant, even if that organ comes from a genetically modified animal. And I just wanted to harken back again, how long it's taken, how much work and science and animal effort and laboratory animal oversight and regulatory review has happened since 1990, when organ transplantation techniques actually won the Nobel Prize. So this is this continuum, you guys. This is the progression I want to emphasize today. We have to keep moving along to get to these progressions. There's no instant fix. When you see and hear in the media and from animal protectionist groups, nothing has been gained. No good science comes from this. No humans have benefited, which is actually a platform that currently many politicians are using to try to abolish animal use in different states. You have background, you have data. I encourage you to look into this. I can help you if you need it to get some talking points available because it is making a difference. And then lastly, where are we with COVID models? And this is the final part of the talk. So all of these animals are potentially susceptible or have been clinically affected by the coronavirus that has been impacting our human populations as well. And we've done a lot of discovery with these models, but I think there's a lot left to be done. So while there's a great excitement about the mask mandates being taken away and lifted, there are still probably variants that will be coming, yet to know if they will be able to jump from what is believed to be from an animal to humans that started this, and the fact that humans haven't been able to infect all of these species that are shown here. The mouse, I just wanted to say there's been some recent publication that some of the variants since the original variant of corona are able to infect normal laboratory mice. But those, what I've seen, have only been done under very specific ABSL3 level high dosing conditions. So we're still using personal protective equipment in our spaces and protecting these animals. So this is important because again, people are saying nothing good has come from animals. There's a lot of fallacy around no animals were even used for the discovery of the vaccine. That also is not true. It's been a continuum of many years, looking through many different types of SARS outbreaks, et cetera, to get to the point where we are today. But if we look at information just from last night, we have a pest population that is carrying this as well. And this is news. This is actually an article that highlights a lot of Penn State University scientists. So again, this is an ethical question. I don't have the answer to it, but what happens again, when we're going to study an animal that typically in our world is we feel is overpopulating our areas. People complain about deer in their gardens. In Michigan, it's a huge problem for accidents on the road because there are so many deer proliferating. But how can we use them maybe in the best way to study the fact that we could learn from them as well? That would require more of a wildlife study. So, all right, so for the future 3 R's then, and my final kind of slide here, there are still going to be concepts to come, maybe from people in this room. I hope from people in this room that add to our deliberation discussion around the 3 R's. And like the white-tailed deer, I think there are going to be additional animal models that we have to consider when we're thinking about our discovery. So just again, the 3 R's to me are really kind of a masterpiece. So this is Van Gogh. If you haven't seen him, he really liked to paint himself. He wanted to learn how to paint from looking at himself. So his very early portraiture is on the left as a younger man, and then kind of moving across. These are different portraits that he did over the course of about 10 years. and the last one being from when he was an artist in Paris. So things change over time. So again, we've got our triptych of this. The 3 R's, if they are evolved in some way, and I've just thrown everything we've talked about onto this slide, it's also a piece of art, right? They've remained ubiquitous in large part because of their benefit to animals, which is important, but they also benefit the stakeholders, people sitting in this room, others that are invested in the animal research enterprise. The exquisiteness of the 3 R's to me is that much like a masterpiece of art, they are inherently subject to broad interpretation across the biomedical community. Reconsidering the foundational 3 R's with progressive interpretations in combination with these different ethical tools that I mentioned today, thinking about analysis and validity assessments, it's all going to be essential as we continue to go forward and consider the appropriate and future animal use. So in artistic terms, we look at it across the landscape, with the eye focusing on different aspects of the portrait, depending on the perspective we bring, the bigger picture and the fine details. And so while it is a masterpiece, I just want to say that it's still a work in progress. And thank you so much for your time. And I'm happy to discuss anything more with you. I just want to mention advocacy groups do a large part in helping us in our work. And so these are all listed along the right here. I really want to thank Holly and Mary and Steve for inviting me to this, all of my lab animal colleagues, and go visit the barns if you haven't, because it's really beautiful, amazing in person and online. So thank you so much.
Okay, so Mary is just making it so that the mics will pick up any questions in the room. I'm happy to kick us off if anyone in the room has a question. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so there's been some talk about a 4th R retirement around our field, around research animal medicine. Can you talk about that and your thoughts?
Yeah, so I have, there are many 4th, 5th, 6th R's, I will say, like reproducibility and rigor being a couple that have come up in my discussions, Leah. So retirement, I actually think this is really great that you brought it up. So for those who maybe aren't aware, there is a strong political drive across many states, and also even organically developing within our lab animal groups or animal research groups to not have to conclude an animal that has given its life to scientific discovery through euthanasia at the end of that project. But instead, if tissues are not necessary or cells are not necessary for harvest, can we rehome that animal or retire it? And so, in fact, what's happened recently is that there have been non-human primates that have been retired, whatever that term is to people, but they go to sanctuaries or zoos, which will allow them then to live out sort of the extent of their full life. I think it can work really well. I think there also has been some backlash because certainly for some of the older non-human primates who've only lived in research environments, it's been challenging in some cases, for example, for chimpanzees to be retired, because when they go into a sanctuary space that has other animals of the same species that already have a dominance hierarchy set up, it has been difficult in those cases at times to introduce animals that maybe also had underlying health conditions, which were manageable with a lot of veterinary care within the research setting, but then maybe are less manageable when they go into the wild. So I think that it's really important to try, but has to be done with some degree of caution to make sure the animals do well. And I'll just share one other thing that from a personal experience, thinking about dogs. Dogs are very much on the political radar for making sure all dogs get adopted into homes after they've completed their research contributions. And we were having that push in the state of Michigan when I was there. And I was very concerned because we worked with a number of animals that were genetically bred specifically for congenital ocular disorders. So we had a lot of blind animals. And I was quite concerned about trying to, the plan from the legislator that was putting this forward was that they would go to a shelter and then be adopted from a shelter. And I was very concerned to take blind animals that kind of knew the scope of their environment. And as anyone who's gone through veterinary training knows, that blind animals do very well in a known environment. But if you move them or move a piece of furniture, if you have a blind animal, it can completely throw them off. So I was very concerned about just this, the greater good, assuming that the animal would do better in a outside of a research environment when actually putting it into a shelter mixed like a kindergarten with all kinds of animals where it can't see, has all kinds of smells, is overwhelmed, and then trying to move it again, I felt actually probably wouldn't be the most humane thing to do. So I think it's really a case-by-case basis, but for sure, if we could give an animal a new home or a new extended opportunity to exhibit its life in species-specific ways, we should definitely look at that.
We have about 5 minutes left. I have a question from those online. So this is coming from Steve Jaffe. And he says he'd love to hear you discuss how animal care vets and other professionals are involved in monitoring animals' use in research once they actually go to labs for the experiments.
Sure. Well, Steve, thanks for that question. I will say what you can't see, if I could flip the camera around, is that the room is full here with my colleagues that do exactly that, that work in animal care, that are veterinary technicians, that are veterinarians by training. And they have all come from various facilities on campus, which I really appreciate to be here, but they are constantly doing rounds. We have veterinary care 365 days a year with rotations. We are assisting and directing and leading surgeries, procedures, offering treatments, rechecking animals. Really, the analogy to, I think maybe the best analogy to provide for someone who's not familiar with it is we're basically like a giant vet clinic. And so we just have all of these staffers who go out and recheck the animals at all times. Our owners, if you will, are the scientists themselves. The animals are the same, and we have a very wide range of species and therefore need a very wide range of expertise to manage them. So that is absolutely what University Lab Animal Resources on campus here of 200 plus people in that group are working toward, is making sure the animals are taken care of every day.
Great. Yes.
I think you said that the IACUC is not responsible for an ethical evaluation of animal use. But I think they are responsible to a cost-benefit analysis, and because those units are not the same, it's not a simple mathematical equation. Does that really come down to an ethical assessment of how they view the benefits versus the cost of the animals?
Yes, and I'm sorry if I misspoke on that, Jim. It's a really great point. So the point I wanted to make is that the IACUC has somehow become the sole ethical arbiter, and that is not fair to put it on them completely, because the science is evaluated by different funding agencies, and then we also have to have ongoing reviews once the projects begin. So it's just to make sure if the public is looking in and saying, why did you let this experiment go forward? The IACUC should have stopped it. That's not the job of the IACUC to make that decision. It has to be a much larger discussion. But certainly it's, I think, on the PI in many ways to answer those questions about the cost benefit analysis. And did you do a literature search? And have you assessed whether this is the best model for you? And then the IACUC takes that information from the expert, if you will, and assesses it more holistically. But it's very rare, as you know, for the IACUC to say, yeah, we don't really believe what the scientists wrote. We're not going to approve this. I mean, that's where I think, if I didn't state it, so thanks for asking me to state it more clearly. We're critical in the review, but it's not solely the committee members. It's all the stakeholders that have to weigh in on that.
I think we have time for one more question. And so we have one from those online. This is coming in from Kate Saylor. And she says, underpowered studies are problematic, but also sometimes numbers are overestimated. Is there any move to improve statistical expertise in IACUC review? And also for researchers, there are often misperceptions about animal numbers needed, for example, for subgroup analysis by both animal researchers and IACUC members.
Yeah, it's a great question, Kate. Thank you. So there is a lot of discussion actually going on. I was involved with a working group for the NIH over the last couple of years where they were considering this exactly on how to think about rigor and reproducibility and approach it in practical ways. And many people in that working group were statisticians by training. And so we've had a lot of discussions around, could every IACUC have a statistician? Is that possible to have someone who has that expertise? And unfortunately, there are far too many IACUCs and far too few statisticians to make something like that happen. But yes, it's very much under discussion on how to do that, not only at the grant funding operation, for example, the NIH in this case, but also making sure that we look at those numbers when an investigator does it. And right now it's largely left to the scientists to do that review of animal numbers. When it comes to the IACUC, again, there's a lot of trust that the PI, the principal investigator, has done the rigorous algorithm that's needed to justify the numbers. And we sort of look at it and make sure numbers add up, make sure it makes sense. And really are, the IACUC is discussing the animal welfare. They aren't there to judge the science quite the same way like a study section would be. So the IACUC really has the welfare piece in mind. We have to rely on others to help us with the number counts. But I agree, overestimation is not unusual, particularly for rodent studies. However, even if, let's say, 100 mice are approved and only 50 are used, we do track just the 50. And there's not ever a push like, hey, you still have 50 animals. Do you want to do more work? That's not how our IACUCs operate. Typically, protocols use the number that they've asked for. And because there's a mismatch between protocols approved for 3 years and grants often approved for 5, more often we see the investigators coming back and asking and justifying why they need to add more animals to their protocols.
Great. Well, we are at time. Thank you so much for this great
Thank you.
contribution, and we look forward to hopefully having more animal research ethics topics covered in the future.
That's great. Thank you again for the invitation. Thanks for coming. Thanks, everyone.